All right, guys. Okay. All right, so everyone should be able to hear me now. And we are going to get started. So those of you that are joining online, welcome, and thank you for the folks that are here today in Mary Ross Park. We've got some gorgeous weather out here for us, thankfully, after a little bit of a cold snap earlier this week. So for those of you guys that don't know, the way we have our First Friday lunches is we usually go through a few little updates before we get started with our speakers. For those of you guys that are calling in for the first time, this illustration was actually donated to us for our 30th anniversary, and we're in the last month of our 30th anniversary. So in the realm of just sharing it and putting it out there one last time before our 30th anniversary year ends, I wanted to share that with you guys. One big update that we have for everyone is we just finished our Giving Tuesday campaign, and it was very successful. This campaign has been growing throughout the years, and we were really hopeful that we were going to break the halfway mark this year. Our goal was to raise $10,000 for the Glen Environmental Coalition's mission. We got to 4,700. And so we were a little disheartened that we didn't make it to our halfway mark, but considering the financial hardships that our community is facing, and also we missed a lot of outreach opportunities due to the pandemic this year, we're sure that we will hit it next year, and we're grateful for the 52 donors that helped us raise that $4,700. Just to reiterate how important these donations are, membership donations are so crucial to the work that we do because of the fact that we can put those donations exactly where they need to go. So unlike some of our grants, that are kind of restricted in a way, if we all of a sudden need some more funds for our Safe Seafood initiative, then we can go ahead and put the money there. Or as some of y'all know, we have been working really hard on improving our Spanish outreach to our local community. And as of right now, we don't have any grant funding for that initiative. So some of our membership donations can be put in that place to help kick off that program while we're still waiting to hear back from some of the foundations that we're seeking support for that initiative. So thank you to everyone who donated. If you didn't get a chance and you're interested, obviously you can still donate to our organization, and we are still fundraising for our 30th anniversary. So you can visit our website and check out some of the giving incentives that we have to help our community and our organization celebrate our 30th year. And the only other update that I had for everyone was the biggest concern on our mind, our consciousness right now, is the Golden Ray salvage that's going on in the St. Simon Sound. There has been a lot of debris since the first section was removed from the ship that's been showing up on our beaches. Some of it's covered in oil and some of it isn't. It really just depends on where it came from within the ship and how it entered the waterway. So we do have a little action item for folks that are listening if they're interested. We're recommending that folks walk the beaches either on St. Simon's or Jekyll Island. We do recommend that you bring gloves with you in case you do find any debris. You can go ahead and remove it from the waterway, so that way when the tide comes back in, we don't have to worry about it going back into the estuary. When you find debris, you actually want to take a picture of it right where you find it. So the picture on the right, he obviously picked it up and then took a picture of it. We want a picture of it right on the beach. That way, we don't have to worry about anyone, kind of saying like, oh, well, they just took a picture of something they found while they were walking around at the St. Simon's Pier. We want to have evidence of it on the beach or wherever you may have found it in the estuary. The picture that's on the left here was actually a picture that was sent to our office from a concerned citizen. And that is a car bumper that was caught in a shrimp trawl 3 miles offshore. So that is just an example of how far this debris is getting pushed around our estuary. And you know, there's a lot of wildlife that can be impacted, and it's really hard to understand the extent of the damage that that can do to our estuary, considering you know, it's kind of like this hidden danger in some instances. Like there's debris that's going to be out there that we might never find. So it's really important for us to document what we find so that we can estimate how much might still be out there. We are recommending that you send photos to our organization. There are also ways to submit photos and report debris to the Unified Command, which feel free to do that as well. But if you send us pictures, just let us know if you went ahead and reported it to the Unified Command, because we are also passing any pictures that we have to the Unified Command. So I'm trying to just kind of funnel all of these images and reports of the debris out there to the Unified Command. There will be what we call a damages claim afterwards, which is a litigation process where they'll settle for lost damages to the ecosystem. So that's part of why this is really important for our community to understand how bad the debris is in the estuary. So with that, I'm actually going to go ahead and get out of the screen and stop sharing. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce Remedial Project Manager Pam Scully. And she's going to kick us off here in talking about LCP Chemicals and where we're at with the cleanup for that site. So Pam, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, should be able to unmute yourself and do your screen share. Thank you.
All right, well, good morning. My name is Pam Scully. I'm the Remedial Project Manager for EPA that works on the LCP Chemicals Georgia Superfund Site. And today we want to give you an update on the progress of our investigations as well as our remedial design at the site. So, let me try to share my screen here. And can you see this map? I wanted to give you a brief overview of the operable units we have at the site. To refresh your memory, the site's been divided into 3 geographic areas. Let's see. If you can see my pointer, the one operable unit is the marsh to the west of the site. The third operable unit is the uplands area of the site. And within the uplands area, underneath the letters site uplands, there's a rectangular area where the former cell buildings were located during the chloroalkyl operations at the site. And that area, as well as the site-wide groundwater, is considered operable unit 3. Operable unit 2, I'm sorry. Why do we have operable units? It's because the site has these different areas, geographic areas, have complexities that really require that we look at them separately. And that's why we've separated it into those operable units. So right now I'm going to introduce Dr. Ram Mohan. He's a senior partner for Anchor QEA and a consultant to Honeywell for the remedial design of the Remedy and Operable Unit 1, the Marsh. Dr. Mohan is an adjunct professor of coastal and ocean engineering at Texas A&M University. He's a member of the National Academy's Marine Board, where he focuses on coastal resilience, and currently serves on the U.S. Committee for the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. He's collaborating with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and authoring national guidance on thin layer placement of dredge materials to restore wetlands and nature and nature-based features for coastal protection. Dr. Mohan is, he's got a lot of achievements in coastal engineering. I'm not going to go into all of them, but he does focus on eco-friendly and sustainable solutions to complex coastal problems. And Ram, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Great. Thank you for that kind and generous introduction, Pam. And good morning, everybody. Happy to be here with you today. Pam, are you going to be running the slides here?
Yes.
Perfect. So what I'll do today is to give you an update on our pilot study for thin cover placement. And this was a requirement of the consent decree to demonstrate the effectiveness of placing a thin layer of material over the existing marsh to promote its natural recovery over time. So we picked an area that you see here on the screen, bearing in mind a couple of considerations. One, we wanted to pick an area that we can study different factors of how you might construct this, what materials, and so on and so forth. We also wanted it to be fairly accessible so that we can effectively get in and out of this area without unduly disturbing the nearby wetland system. And then we also wanted to use materials that are generally compatible with what's in the local marsh system there. So we picked materials from local quarries as we went on with this study. This was a study that required 2-year monitoring. So basically we had monitoring every 6 months. And we just completed our 24-month monitoring. So that's what we'll be focusing on today. If you go to the next slide, what we show there is really how this area was set up. So as you can see on the picture there, the graphic, we have 4 quadrants. Those are the 4 sub areas there, A1, A2, B1, and B2. And why they're there is because we wanted to test, first of all, different material types. So the ones that are marked A received a finer blend of material that included some topsoil in it. And then area that's marked B received a fine sand material. So that material is a little bit coarser than what you would find in area A. And within those sub areas, we also tested material placement between 6 inches and 12 inches. So what we're aiming for around 6 to 9. So with construction tolerances and everything, generally we're aiming for 6 to 12 to understand the effects of how the marsh would respond to that. What we were out to evaluate to demonstrate the effectiveness was really because we're placing this over existing vegetation. Studies had demonstrated that essentially we'll have an initial smothering of the vegetation, but that marsh will come back vigorously over time and typically within a couple of growing seasons. So that's the number one point we wanted to demonstrate. The studies that I mentioned generally were in southern marsh systems, so Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, and so on. So we wanted it specifically for this project. And then we also wanted to make sure that the material we place there is stable and it provides an isolation, mainly to act as a restoration layer for the marsh to come back stronger in terms of natural recovery. If you go to the next slide, what we have here is the results of over time. So as I mentioned, soon after the thin layer placement, and thin layer placement, for those who may not be familiar with it, is sort of a technique of sort of reining in the material using a hydraulic spray. So it's kind of like a garden hose, but it's a little bit more applied pressure, and it'll shoot the material so that the forces of impact are minimal. As expected, on the right side top picture, you can see it looks like the slurry has covered the material. Then we move on to the 12-month, which is March of 2019. You see the material is kind of stabilized, vegetation is still submerged. And in 18 months, you cannot see it that well. This was November 2019. You see a little bit of vegetation shooting back through the rhizomes, the root mass, and in some of those areas. And then the picture on the left, the 24-month, shows some vigorous growth back in, within the pilot test area. And I'll show a little bit of a close-up of some of the segments here. So if you go back, I'm sorry, actually we could stay here. So if you go to the quadrants, we can see the, the left is the area we call A2. That's what we're seeing here. What we are monitoring it is we GPS tag this area, and the box you see, that location is the same location we come back to. So over the 6, 12, the 6, 12, 18, and 24 months. So we can see exactly how that area is changing over time. And I think this picture is self-explanatory. You can see in 24 months, it has recovered very well. And we have another example in the next slide, which shows an area B2 in the grid. And that also shows very strong recovery against from the start over time and back in 24 months in the right-hand slide there on the bottom photo. So if you go back 2 more slides, Pam, to that one that we showed. So essentially in a nutshell, I'm sorry, the other one. Yeah. So in a nutshell, what we have here is there's strong vegetative regrowth that we were able to demonstrate. We did put a test material at the bottom of this, the cover material, just to test how stable this material would be. And I have some photos here a little later. But that material remained intact, confirming that the material was stable. We looked at habitat recovery, mainly in terms of fiddler crab counts and burrowing and the properties of the burrow, and they were all consistent with what we would see in a marsh of this nature. So that recovered very well. And the chemistry, one thing I should note is this was really very low contamination levels in this area in general. So that's why we felt a natural recovery restoration with a thin cover would be the best, most sustainable remedy for this. And we were able to show through chemical monitoring over time that we are well within the EPA's risk-based remedial goals for the site. So if you go 3 more slides forward, you'll see a core right there. Thank you, Pam. This is the core samples we took within the 4 quadrants that I showed earlier, A1, A2, B1, B2. Look at the green coloring in the core, that's towards the middle of the core. So that really is the bottom, thank you. That really is the bottom of the cover material. So our theory was that if the cover erodes away or is lost in some other manner, we would either see the green on the surface or we would see the green kind of distributed in that overall area. As you can see from all 4 of these cores, the green is exactly where it is supposed to be and it hasn't moved. So thereby demonstrating that the material was stable. So where we are headed from here in the next slide is really a summary of what we're doing here. So we are actually collecting, analyzing all this data, and we're very close to submitting our first major design document for the marsh area, and that'll be coming to EPA in January 2021. After agency review, we will then continue with the full engineering design for construction of this remedy for the remaining marsh areas, with a target date of having the construction documents ready by December 2021, with an anticipated construction start sometime in the fall of 2022. And that's the briefing I had. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer. Thank you.
And I think, Ram, we're going to actually hold off until questions until the end. So if you don't mind just hanging out with us. I don't see any questions in the chat right now. Yeah. I think, Pam, did you want to add anything before we hand it over to Rob?
No, we're happy to have OU1 progressing, and we look forward to getting in the field and getting that accomplished. But yes, I'll turn it over to Rob now.
Okay, hi, I'm Rob Pope. I'm the RPM working on Operable Unit 2, which is the cell building area, former cell building area, which now has a soil cover over it and that rectangle that Pam was showing earlier. So let me share my screen here. file in here. There we go. Okay. Here we go. So again, I'm Rob Pope. I'm working with Pam on the site. She covers operable units 1 and operable unit 3 that we'll talk about later, or she will talk about later. And operable unit 2 is that former cell building area, and then all of the site-wide groundwater to be addressed. Most of the contamination emanating from that cell building area. So here's that same picture that Pam showed. I don't want to belabor this too much, but the marsh is the huge aerial volume of the site. The upland, which is operable unit 3, is the next largest area volume of the site. And then right under those words, site upland is operable unit 2. However, we are also going to look at all the groundwater in the site, which is basically from operable unit 2 towards the salt marsh and a few other areas. So here is kind of a zoom in of that, just to kind of give you a feel. This is the upland area, zoomed in a little bit. You can see the public road out here. This is the main road coming into the site, and the causeway that goes out to the site, if you can follow my pointer. And then this little tan colored rectangle is where the cell buildings were in the past, and where the soil cover currently exists with the fence around it, and will be the focus of the work for operable unit 2. Each one of these yellow dots you can see represents a monitoring well that has been installed, and you can see some of them are actually out in the salt marsh and down the causeway. This is just the monitoring well network for the upper aquifer, the Satilla aquifer, right beneath the land surface here. There is also additional wells that go down into what's called the Ebenezer aquifer, more than 50 feet below the surface. This just gives you an idea. There's a pretty fair spread of wells here. In addition, if you go out to the site today, there are a large number of other well points that were used in the removal actions that I'm going to talk about here. So the removal action was to address this really high pH groundwater, which was due to the release of the caustic material that was used by LCP during operations. So normal groundwater, we expect to see in kind of the range of a 6 to 8 pH, with 7 being neutral. The groundwater prior to these removal actions was really around 12 to 13 at LCP, which is extremely high. When you have a pH that is that high, and so this is the opposite of an acidic situation, it's a basic situation, but it still causes metals that are in the soil aquifer, that are in the soil matrix of the aquifer, or that have been released to the environment. It forces them into solution when the pH changes like that. And so there are a number of metals that are in solution in the groundwater, or that have been in solution in the groundwater as a result of that high pH. Some of them we think are metals that are naturally occurring, that have been forced in solution, and that causes a problem. And some of them, of course, are metals that have been released into the environment due to operations at LCP in the past. So the removal action that has been fairly successful is they injected carbon dioxide into the superficial aquifer. The carbon dioxide reacted with the basic solution of the groundwater and actually lowered that pH. So when we were up around 13, the carbon dioxide was very effective at causing a chemical reaction in the aquifer to get that pH to lower down to 10 or below even. And remember, our neutral pH is 7, and what we like to see in most aquifers is something in the 6 to 8 range. So they have done 4 phases of injections across the site. The first phase was more kind of a trial to see if this would work, and it was very successful. And then we spread out and did a couple of more phases. And then with an investigation effort that's feeding into the remedial investigation, another kind of a lobe of contamination of the caustic was discovered that had not been fully picked up before. And so we did a 4th injection of CO2. And the overall response to those removal actions, those 4 phases of injections, has been that it has been very successful in lowering the pH. And as it lowered the pH, also the metals in groundwater have lowered in concentration. Many of them have become affixed back into the soil matrix. It's not the final answer, but it has been a really successful initial attempt to affect the pH of the groundwater and the metals concentrations in the groundwater. So our next step here is to do a remedial investigation report for operable unit 2. One has already been completed, obviously, for operable unit 1, and it's already been completed for operable unit 3. So now we're moving into that phase for operable unit 2. The PRPs are submitting draft sections of the RI report. They've submitted one already this fall, and we'll get additional sections as we move forward into 2021. EPA and Georgia Environmental Protection Division with the state of Georgia, we're going to review those submittals and work with the PRPs to scope that remedial investigation report. And then once it has been fully submitted and reviewed, the PRPs are going to begin submitting sections of the feasibility study. Now, the feasibility study is something that's already been accomplished again for operable unit 1 and was not needed for operable unit 3 really, but for operable unit 2, this will start proposing what we might try to do to address the contamination in the groundwater and contamination in the soil and address the cell building area overall. So, and as with the RI, the PRPs are going to submit that in sections. EPA and the state are going to, again, review those submittals and work with the PRPs to scope out that feasibility study. And again, once it's been fully submitted and reviewed, EPA will use the information in the remedial investigation and the feasibility study to prepare a proposed plan. And that proposed plan will lay out what EPA is proposing to address the contamination in the groundwater and soil and the cell building area in all of operable unit 2. That is the plan with our proposed plan. Now, we're not just going to go away and work in our ivory tower and not communicate with anybody while we do this, of course. Our plans are to have multiple meetings with the community as we work through this and give you updates, and also really gather input and feedback from the community on the cleanup alternatives that we're considering and what you're interested in, as well as redevelopment options. The property is Honeywell's property at this point, and right now it's zoned basic industrial, and there are some redevelopment options certainly through that. But we really wanted to have that open conversation and work with the PRPs and work with the community and see what those options could be, and make sure that the cleanup alternatives we're looking at and proposing are going to mesh with those redevelopment options that might be out there. So our current plan is to issue a proposed plan really in the 2022 to 2023 timeframe. So really about a year, possibly 2 years from now. Well, really, we're talking late 2022 or early 2023. So we're looking 2 to 3 years from now, because we really have to work through this whole remedial investigation and that feasibility study. It's going to take us some time to get all that information together and analyze it, and also share it with you and get your feedback. So as I mentioned before, that proposed plan will hopefully address all of the risks posed to human health and the environment from the groundwater and the subsurface soil and aquifer matrix. It's not going to really do any additional work for the marsh. That's all covered under operable unit 1, or it's not really going to do anything about the surface soil for the uplands. That's all covered in operable unit 3. So it's really going to be focused on that groundwater and that cell building area and the subsurface soil there that we need to work with. So kind of our next steps, just to summarize what I've already said, is that EPA and the state will be continuing to review and work with the PRP on the remedial investigation report and the feasibility study submittals. And one thing that might be different from ways you've seen this done in the past is a lot of times it's common for the entire document to come in at once, and it can be a very huge and overwhelming document. and then, to go through multiple rounds of that document. And what we're trying to do instead is break it into the chunks that we can work out all the nitty-gritty details, and then have a final document that doesn't take multiple rounds, we hope. So as we do that, we will host periodic updates with the community regarding the progress, and then hopefully get your input and feedback on where we are and what we're working on. And then right now, we expect to hold the next OU2 update really in the spring of 2021. So not that far off. And maybe by then we'll be in a place where we can have a meeting that's not as virtual and more in face-to-face, but we'll see. And those are our next steps. So I don't think I have anything else. And I think I'm going to hand it back over to Pam here for Operable Unit 3. And then I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end of all the presentations.
And Rob, before you disappear, we did have one question in the chat.
Okay.
So we're doing really good on time. So I'm going to just let you answer this question. Can you describe a bit of the process of installing and sampling groundwater monitoring wells in the marsh areas, and some details about the marsh groundwater monitoring wells themselves? And we'll just take that one question, and then we'll go. You can go ahead and.
Okay. Well, most of those wells were installed before I came on the project. I do have to be honest about that. And so I do not have with me the intimate details kind of how those wells were installed. The normal process would be to get out into the marsh and have those wells inserted down through the marsh into the aquifer below the marsh. And normally these wells are either stainless steel or carbon steel or PVC pipe installations that are screened at a certain depth and then inserted down below. So I really will have to get back on those details. Most of those monitoring wells have existed for some time, and maybe answer that with a little more detail. But that's kind of the normal way you would do that. Some of these you can see are right at the edge of the marsh, and so they really were probably working on the solid land and installing those wells with a drilling rig there. When you get out into the marsh, it might be a slightly different proposition because you're already in the marsh, and having a vehicle out there sometimes is not that stable. So it might have been a slightly different method. And I will have to double check and make sure I know exactly what that is before I speak out of hand. But I will take that question, Rachel, and research the details and get back to you so you can share the answer.
Great, thank you.
If I might add one little thing here, if we got enough time, just so people understand, the wells in general at the site, which is typical, are stratified. So you have some wells that sample water from the shallowest part of the water bearing zone in this upper aquifer. And you also have some wells that sample water maybe 5 feet deeper or 10 feet deeper, maybe in an intermediate level of the upper aquifer. And then there's also some deep wells in the upper unit, the Satia, and the upper water bearing unit that sample water from the bottom of this aquifer. So while groundwater flows between the shallow, intermediate, and deeper levels of this one sand unit that has water, it can vary depending on the depth. And so the data that's collected allows EPA and us to look at the water quality at different points in the aquifer, which is about 30 feet thick, maybe, Rob, is that correct?
From land surface to the cemented sandstone for the Ebenezer, really it's about 50 feet thick. But there are undulations, of course, in the surface a little bit and thickness of the aquifer. So
and you've got some dry sand above the water.
Yeah, and there's some dry sand that is the.
But at any rate, I just want people to understand it's not just like it's a very sophisticated way to look at water quality within a superficial aquifer.
Yeah,
multiple depths.
Thank you, Frank. That is true. That there's been a pretty concerted effort to determine what it's like at different depths within this aquifer. And of course, the closest you get to the marsh, that vadose then starts disappearing. And so the aquifers really at the surface there are very close.
And also, just to close this out, there's the aquifer that's below that Rob mentioned, the Ebenezer, which is below a cemented sandstone layer. It's also monitored, not as much, but it's definitely monitored.
Right. There are a number of wells in the Ebenezer.
Okay, sorry about interrupting.
No, I am muted. I'm sorry. There are a number of wells in the Ebenezer that are also being used in this remedial investigation, most of them pre-existing. And of course, there are two major horizontal wells that go through pretty much the entire zone here that pick up contamination as well. So yeah, there's a good bit of sampling in both aquifers. But yeah, this picture definitely shows there's a number of wells in the upper Satilla aquifer and not as many in the Ebenezer. And we are seeing most of the contamination in the Satilla. There is definitely some in the Ebenezer, but not at the same level we're seeing in Satilla, which makes sense because it went from the land surface through the closest aquifer first. All right, I think that's all I have, Rachel.
All right, great. Thank you so much. And we're going to go ahead and pass it back to Remedial Project Manager Pam Scully, so she can talk a little bit about Operable Unit 3, which is the upland soils, and where they are in the process of the proposed plan and the record of decision for that site.
All right. So let's see. Am I sharing my screen now?
Nope. There we go. I think Rob just stopped sharing, and you should be able to go ahead. Yep, we can.
Am I sharing?
Yes. Yep, we got it.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about Operable Unit 3, which is the upland area. And this areas in pink were evaluated as part of the upland. The little rectangular, or my attempt at rectangular area in the center of that is Operable Unit 2, where the cell buildings are located, so that is not included. And what we did in Operable Unit 3 was consider all of the previous removal actions that took place in the mid-1990s. This shows what goal, this slide here shows what goals we were trying to achieve as part of that cleanup, and the areas and depths where material was excavated and disposed of primarily off-site. Clean soil was put back in these areas, and it covered a lot of the area. Then we knew that there were contaminants that remained on the site. We weren't able to get every area to the goals that we went in and established. So we went back and did a human health risk assessment, as well as an ecological risk assessment. And the human exposure pathways that we evaluated were the industrial worker, the future excavation worker, the current and future trespasser, and a future hypothetical resident. And when we did that, we looked at exposure units. And this figure shows that we divided the site into, we had the former off-site tank areas, as well as these 4 quadrants that we divided the site into. The reason we divided the site into these quadrants is because the current zoning and expected future development of the site is for basic industrial use. What we concluded as part of that remedial investigation was that the EPA, there's no remedial action is necessary in Operable Unit 3 to protect human health and the environment based on the current and future industrial use. So the upland removals that took place in the mid-1990s were successful at removing the contaminants and the concern, and there's minimal environmental risk. We also looked at whether or not those surface soils were going to be leaching to groundwater, and determined that most of the groundwater issues are at depth. We do believe that we need some restrictions to prevent residential use of this area, and we would propose to do that through the post-removal site controls. So we did have a proposed plan issued. Because we didn't find risk to human health based on future anticipated use, we did not propose any alternatives. We did have a 90-day comment period at the request of the community, and we did receive 47 different comments from 20 different parties that we evaluated and responded to as part of the responsiveness summary and the record of decision. Most of the comments centered around the ATSDR 2014 public health assessment that suggested additional cleanup was needed at 4 half-acre exposure units for commercial industrial use. And we did address those comments. I'm just gonna talk real quickly that the ATSDR public health assessment evaluated exposure units on at half-acre size. That half-acre size is more appropriate for a residential exposure than a basic industrial, which is what the property is currently zoned for and what we expect it to be used as in the future. We did communicate this concern to ATSDR prior to their publication of the public health assessment in 2014. We believe that EPA's risk assessment is more appropriate and the larger areas are used to evaluate exposure on an industrial setting. So that is what the explanation between the difference between public health assessment and what EPA has proposed. So our next steps, we had a no action record of decision that was signed in September of this year. Because it's a no action record of decision, there is not a follow-up consent decree required. We will try to get the post-removal site control, which prevents the property from being developed into a residential use, by March of this year. If we're not able to get it by March, we'll get it as soon as we can. We will work with the state of Georgia to achieve that. The post-removal site controls, I don't know if Stacy's on and she wants to talk about it, but our attorney Stacy Hare has been working with Honeywell and we'll work with Georgia EPD to get those in place. It'll be in the form of an environmental covenant. It'll be pursuant to the Georgia Uniform Environmental Covenants Act. It'll be legally enforceable by both EPA and Georgia EPD. It'll run with the land when the land is sold, and it'll be recorded in the Glenn County real property records. So the restrictions we anticipate at this point will be no residential use and no groundwater use except for sampling, investigation, and remediation at this point. And that's all I have.
Great, thank you, Pam. And just to wrap up the decision on operable unit 3, we did have Frank Anastasi, our technical advisor, on the call today to just touch base with some of the comments that were submitted during the proposed plan, some of the main community concerns, and then how the EPA addressed those. So Frank, I know he doesn't have a presentation or anything prepared, but he just wanted to talk for a few moments about that, and then we'll jump into the Q&A.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, in the ROD, if you've reviewed it, there's a section that summarizes first all of the comments, the concerns that EPA received on the ROD and proposed plan. I mean, the proposed no action. And then there's actually copies of every submitted comment from the different interested parties. So part 3 of the ROD is this responsiveness summary where that material is. So I'd encourage anybody that wants to look into this in more detail to find it there. And those things are accessible on the EPA website. In general, the concerns were this apparent disconnect between the ATSDR findings that there were some small localized areas of elevated levels of certain residual contamination, that if you performed a assessment of potential human health risks according to the way ATSDR did it, they found some excess levels of risk at certain areas, a few areas, and the EPA is finding that there's no unacceptable risk. And so a big area of disconnect and uncertainty with commenters was, how can this be? And the explanation is the manner in which the assessment of health risk was done. For the ATSDR, they looked at much smaller areas, and so 1 or 2 samples with high levels of contamination in a very small area would end up with an average. You'd end up with an average level of contamination that's higher than if you had a much larger area and you still had a handful of high samples, but you had so many more lower samples, samples with lower contamination levels. When you'd average it out, you would have a much lower dose of contamination, to make it simple to understand. So that would result in a lower risk overall. So for the EPA risk assessment, it meets the requirements of the Superfund program. You have a certain finding, and then the ATSDRs much more closely looked at, ended up with a few areas with higher risk. So a lot of people were saying, what's the deal? And some comments were, why don't you just go out and find those areas and remove that additional contaminated soil, or maybe sample to find out if it really is still there, because there have been removals. There's some uncertainty. These samples were collected historically at different stages, and there may not be actual information on the details of these samples, although it really should be, because the ATSDR assessment should identify which samples they used. So the answer is that EPA is basically guaranteeing that the future development and use of the site would not be residential, which would have a much higher risk, and not be commercial, but would be purely industrial use, which envisions large parcels of area, and that supports the scenarios that EPA evaluated, so they got their risk levels. So that was one area of concern. Another area of concern was that the ecological risk assessment wasn't really as thorough as it could be, and EPA's was limited in availability of flora and fauna, bugs and bunnies and plants and things. And so the ecological risk assessment is somewhat limited. And some people pointed out that some other very technical details, and this is a very technical, complicated process to do ecological risk assessments. But in general, the EPA findings of ecological risk were just on the boundary of significant enough to warrant further looking, or not significant. And there's a large margin of error in there. So again, it seems to support the finding that there's no remedial action necessary for ecological protection. Let me check one thing. Well, I don't need to check. The other area of concern was the institutional controls. People were asking about how can you, in general, how are you going to protect us in the future? And as Pam laid out, this is something that was relatively new 10 or 15 years ago, where we decided that, okay, if we can't remove all contamination from a contaminated property, like a Superfund site, we can leave some, but if we can keep it from affecting traveling and getting to be able to expose people or the environment to it, then it's okay, as long as people know it's there. So you don't go and sell the land and allow someone to try to dig a 3-story parking garage under the building and build a building that way, which would encounter this residual contamination. So the deed restriction is basically what it is. Just like if you bought property and there was a gas pipeline that ran through it, that property would come with a deed restriction noting the location of the gas pipeline and noting that intrusion in that area is prohibited. So so that's a really important aspect of this project going forward. And I have a question I wanted to throw back out to EPA about this. Pam, in your summary slide, you were specific that the deed restriction will prevent residential use. But I haven't seen anywhere that you guys are going to insert in there or see that it gets inserted, that you're going to prevent commercial use. And I wonder if y'all considered that and what your feelings are, because basically we have ATSDR saying with a commercial use for a risk assessment scenario, we think you have some areas that could present unacceptable risk. And EPA is saying, well, that's okay because we're not going to have commercial, we're going to have just industrial. But the question I want to put to y'all is, if the deed restriction does not say there can be no residential and there can be no commercial use, then that does potentially have leave an opportunity for some type of commercial use in the future, and possibly based on the APSDR's work, unacceptable risks to people in a commercial use scenario. So what do y'all, how do you respond to that concern?
Thank you. And I'd like to say that the site is zoned basic industrial. So if the zoning changed, the EPA, will be at this site doing reviews every 5 years. So we'll know if use at the property takes place or if use that's different than the restriction takes place. Also, because it's zoned basic industrial, I think it limits anything smaller than actually 5 acres from being developed for use. So I don't think there'll be a small half-acre use that's allowed by the current zoning. We have close relationships with the people in Glenn County. We have close relationships with Georgia EPD, and we don't expect that there's going to be an opportunity for someone to develop the site without us knowing it, particularly because right now it belongs to Honeywell and they would have to sell the site. We would have to have a prospective purchaser discussion with anybody who purchases a Superfund site to make clear what can be done with that property. So, I'll talk to Stacy. I know she's online right now, but apparently she's not able to unmute her microphone, about whether or not we can add commercial use to that. But I think, the current zoning is what we're trying to restrict it to. If we didn't evaluate it in the risk assessment, we have some inability to add that to the covenant, but we're certainly involved enough in the development around there to ensure that it doesn't occur. As the operable unit 2 moves forward, there may be additional restrictions that we are going to add based on that remedy to this area. So, I think that our attempt is to get this initial covenant in place, and then the covenant may have to be modified as time goes on.
Okay, so it's really not, you're not considering an option to just limit the restrictions, add the no commercial use to that.
Well, we didn't evaluate, we didn't do a risk assessment for commercial use. We did a risk assessment for future industrial, and we did a risk assessment for future residential. So our intent is to restrict it based on the risk assessment we did. And right now it's our intent is we can't restrict it beyond what it's currently zoned at and what our current future use is.
Okay, so there are your institutional EPA program, Superfund program requirements that you have to follow, and that doesn't allow you to insert this at this time, that you restriction against commercial. However, as I recall, I could be mistaken, early drafts of the risk assessment included a commercial risk scenario, correct?
I don't know. I wasn't involved in the site when the early drafts were proposed, but in the final assessment, it was an industrial use.
Right, but commercial was, I'm sure now, commercial scenarios were modeled early on in the risk assessment process. There's some Honeywell documents I reviewed. But anyway, you've answered the question. I just wanted to bring that up as something to mention. And then there's a question I have. Are there opportunities for the GEC or other concerned people in the community to be involved as the institutional control deed restriction process moves forward? Like you get a chance to comment on a proposed plan. is there an opportunity for GEC or other interested parties to be involved with the state and EPA as they develop the deed restriction?
You know, I would have to refer to Stacy. Is there any way we can unmute Stacy's mic and let her?
Pam, I've been trying not to cut anyone off, but I actually added her as a co-host as soon as
Okay.
all said. So Stacy, you should be able to unmute yourself and provide some input here.
Okay, so everyone can hear me now? The question about community input into the restrictive covenants, I'll admit none have ever asked to be part of that process, but I don't see why we couldn't share a draft of our document, because we're working closely with the state to make sure that the restrictions that EPA and Honeywell come up with comply with Georgia law on environmental covenants. And since we'll be sharing drafts with the state, I don't know why we can't share drafts with you and see what you think about it. So Frank, if you want to see them, I'm waiting for a draft from Honeywell's attorney. We've already started talking about it. We plan to base the legal document on the format that the Georgia law suggests, because that's been successfully used at other Superfund sites in Georgia.
Sure. Well, I'm interested, but my client GEC will decide what they want to do about that. But sure, that sounds very promising.
And Stacy, we would definitely be interested in being involved with that and sharing that with our membership and our community as it continues. So at any point, if there's something that you can share with us, and then that way I can put Frank to work and we can get that information out to the public, that would be fantastic. I am gonna just trying to keep us on time here. There were some questions in the chat that I wanted to try to get to before we have to end. And so the first question was from Alice Kais, who's with 100 Miles. And the question is, can RAM offer up a map of where the pilot is in the context of the whole site? He mentioned lower concentrations there, but the thin layer cap is proposed in areas where there is high concentrations of contaminants. How will they test the effectiveness of the chemical contaminant in the areas with higher concentrations? And Ram, just so you know, that question is in the chat, or I'll go ahead and post it in the chat so that you can see the full question there.
Sure. Thank you. So I can share a map. Let me see if this will work. Can you all see a map now?
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect. So I think that might have been misunderstood. What I said or meant to say was that when you look at all of the remedial areas, the locations where we are proposing thin cover are generally much lower concentration compared to other areas that are within channels that have either a dredging or capping remedy. So within the context of remedial cleanup goals, the thin cover areas to begin with, for the most part, barely exceed those cleanup criteria. So therefore, a restoration layer that would be applied there would be a very good way to accelerate recovery in a sensitive habitat like a marsh as opposed to in channel areas. So now having clarified that, the question is still a great question. So how would we, so you can see the map, I'm gonna have to turn because it's on another screen, so I apologize. But you see the pilot area on the upper left corner. All areas that are yellow are the thin cover areas. So, that's why we picked that area, because we could address it without actually disturbing the other areas while we wait for the remedial design to be completed and construction to begin. The concentrations there are very representative of concentrations you would expect in the thin cover areas within all of those yellow ranges. So generally, they're not the lowest points, they're not the highest point, they're representative of those. And how we would, advance this to a remedial design, just like any other study where you do a scalability as long as the underlying assumptions are reasonable, scientifically speaking, the extrapolation would be good. Here, since we're within the range, I don't see any concern whatsoever.
All right, and I think the next question was also from Alice, but this one is directed, okay, wait, hold on, I'm just scrolling through. Okay, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but how will the EPA and Honeywell adjust cleanup plans to account for changes expected and likely release of contaminants that are covered up in the realm of climate change and sea level rise? So I'm not sure if anyone wants to address that question.
I think that this is Pam Scully, but I think that as far as climate change goes, on sites where we have contamination left in place, we were relying on our 5-year reviews of those sites to warn us when action needs to be taken, and we'll evaluate them as we monitor the site. If an action needs to be taken, we'll determine, at that time, what we need to do, and we'll go to the community with a plan to do that. We don't have any specific action items right now, but that's the intent of Superfund, is that we'll constantly monitor those sites.
And this is Rob Pope of EPA. It is also something that we will take into consideration as we move forward with Operable Unit 2. As we evaluate remedies for the cell building area and the groundwater, we will take into account that the site is a coastal site right next to a saltwater marsh, and that any remedy that we use is going to have to be implementable in an area like that, and that there is the possibility of sea level rise, and of course there's always a possibility of storm impacts on a coastal site like this. So we will have to take those into account, and that's something EPA will be looking at to make sure is in the alternatives analysis, the feasibility study, and something we'll be making sure Honeywell addresses as they look at the different alternatives. And so that's not something that we're just going to ignore. That's always something you want to pay attention to in a coastal site, and we will continue to pay attention to that.
All right, the next question, also coming from Alice, is can you clarify the zoning designation of the site? Glynn County has several different industrial designations with varying allowed uses. From what she understands, the current basic industrial as defined by Glynn County allows for things like private recreation, horticulture, and dredging. It also allows individuals to reside on the site. Did EPA's assessment consider this?
I can tell you that we know that it's zoned basic industrial. Our exposure units were based on development for larger area and larger employers in an industrial type setting. So if development occurs and when the property is sold, if Honeywell sells the property, what we will do is have a prospective purchaser discussion with any party that wants to purchase the land. That's how we do it at Superfund sites, to discuss what their development opportunities are and what they have to be careful of in developing a Superfund site such as this. So I don't think there's going to be any kind of development that EPA is not involved with and doesn't know about. Stacy, do you have anything else to add on that?
One of the comments was that certain residences are allowed on the site. We did do a residential risk assessment. We have determined that that's not a good use for the site, and we will restrict residential use. So even if basic industrial allows for like a resident caretaker, our restrictions would not allow that. You may see later on in the chat room, we've had a note from our human health risk assessor, Kevin Koporik, who's on the phone. and that it addresses the commercial versus industrial risk assessment process. And I don't know if we want to try to unmute Kevin, but he's written a nice note there about, half the exposure unit size is not all that different from commercial to industrial use.
And I'll just go ahead and read the comment just because we're getting close to the end and there's a few more questions from the public. So in EPA risk assessments, the only real difference between commercial and industrial use scenario is the size of the exposure unit or area. As Pam stated, the half-acre parcel that ATSDR assumed in their assessment is smaller than EPA would typically assume for either an industrial or commercial exposure scenario. So I think that hopefully will address that answer. And I do appreciate, Stacy, you pointing out that even if the industrial zoning allows a residential caretaker, that your covenants are going to restrict that. I think that's part of the distinction that Alice was looking for. So I appreciate that. One question from actually one of our Facebook Live folks, and I think this is directed towards Rob on the groundwater. How many wells are there and how many times are each well sampled and tested? And then are those results public? If you want to answer that for us, Rob.
Yeah, I haven't, I don't have a count of all the wells in front of me. There is in the range between, and I know this is a wide range, I apologize, but I did not prepare for that particular question. So between 30 and 50 wells, site, well, actually more than that, between probably 40 and 60 wells site-wide. The great majority of wells, of course, are concentrated around the cell building area where we know the contamination emanated from the LCP operations, and down gradient of there with, of course, wells along and in the salt marsh to understand how the groundwater is getting out of the site. And the flow of groundwater is generally towards the marsh and away from the public road there. So that's why most of the wells are clustered in that area. And what was could you repeat the rest of that for me, please, Rachel?
The second portion was just if the results were public.
Yeah, I mean, all of the well results, the sampling results are in the site files and in the reading room that's available online for Operable Unit 2 and the site in general. So they're easily available to the public. As far as how there was another part of the question in the middle about sampling of the wells. Can you read that? So I get the words right?
Hold on one second. Or how many times are each well sampled and tested?
Yeah, so that varies heavily. Some of these wells are all the way back into the 90s when the removal actions started and EPA's initial involvement, and some of these wells have been installed as late as 2 years ago. So you're going to have varying amount of sampling for all these wells. And of course, we're much more interested in the sampling more recently than the historic sampling, because sampling methods are better, analysis methods are better, well installation methods are better as well. And we want to get a snapshot of what the groundwater looks like in the present time frame. And so, as far as how many times has each well been sampled, all of them have been sampled multiple times. They haven't all been sampled at once. Some of them were sampled in conjunction with these removal injections. And so some of them have been sampled more times to be able to monitor those injections and other work that's been done at the site. So it's not a straightforward answer, just because the site's very old and there's a lot of different work there and injected things multiple times and been checking in those injection areas, which is a smaller subset of the whole. There has been multiple rounds of sampling every well that was currently on the site from the 90s up until 2017. And we did a very major sampling in 2020 to support the remedial investigation report for groundwater that got almost all of the wells, and really, but we concentrated on the wells that were in the zone of contamination we're worried about in the cell building. So we have all the wells that have been sampled multiple times. Some of them have been sampled a lot more just because of the work that's being done at the site. So I know that's not a clear answer, but that's kind of the way it is, just the age of the site and all the different work that's been done.
Hey, if I could add real quickly, there's a relatively recent report that EPA has available now on the website, the site characterization report, I believe is the right title, but it has a summary of a lot of data and graphical representations of groundwater data for different contaminants. So that's a resource, Rob. You can confirm that that's available on the EPA website. And as well, for the people's information, I prepared a review memo that summarizes that, and you could get that from the GEC, as well as a similar memo on the OU 3 ROD. So if anyone wants that kind of detailed technical information, GEC can point you to it, to like a primer on it, and then you can get the full-blown info on the EPA website. But the site characterization report for the cell buildings and groundwater area, that's a recent compilation of a lot of the data that the questioner is asking about.
That's great. Thank you, Frank, for reminding me of that. But yeah, that is the most recent finalized report, the site characterization summary report that EPA approved this summer, and both the state and EPA reviewed it and made comments on it. And that was actually done in preparation for the remedial investigation report. So while that report is out there, we're going to take all of that information really to go into the remedial investigation report, as well as a major sampling that was just completed in August 2020 that will update even what's in that report. So the RI report is going to have all the major and most recent information on the groundwater when it comes out.
Thank you guys so much. And then there's one more question, and it's actually from me. And I'm going to direct it at either Pam or Ram. You, in the response to the conclusions for the pilot study, I feel like what I'm hearing is that it worked, but what I'm not hearing is any level of detail between what worked better or maybe what didn't work as well. So what I understand is that there's different types of sediment that was sprayed over the pilot study area, and there's different thicknesses. So can you guys comment on the variance between the plots and, you know, which sediment type worked better, which thickness worked better? Because I feel like that's really what we're going to be expecting as we go into next year when you guys are finalizing the remedial design and remedial action plan.
Yes, actually, I can comment on that if that's okay. So, you know, it's something that I should have mentioned. Apologize for skipping that. So we do have actually good data. So generally what we found was, you know, Pam mentioned a guidance that I'm writing with the Army Corps of Engineers. So in that, generally we recommend when you restore wetlands that we keep the thickness of placement to less than 12 inches for accelerated vegetative regrowth. So that's the other reason we tested both 6 and 12 inches. What we found was if the plots that had the thinner placement, relatively speaking, i.e. the 6-inch layer, performed actually better compared to the 9 to 12-inch layers. So that was one conclusion we took back, and from a chemistry perspective, it worked equally effectively. So there was no real difference in chemical performance. There was actually a better vegetative recovery in keeping the material thickness to 6 inches. And then when you kept the material thickness essentially to the thinner layer, the 6-inch, there wasn't really a measurable difference between the fine material and the coarse material. If you were to go to thicker material placement thicknesses, then the higher density of the sandy, more coarser material generally would mean that you would need more growing seasons for the marsh to recover to its natural state. So both techniques, both materials, both thicknesses would work. One would be a faster recovery in terms of time scale compared to the other. Did that clarify the question?
Yes, I appreciate that. And then just one kind of follow up. So it's my understanding that Spartina alterniflora, or smooth cord grass, has the ability to migrate contaminants from their root beds to the surface. And so I'm wondering if you guys have done any vegetative testing to ensure that the grass itself is not going to be migrating contaminants to the surface even after the remedy is put in place.
We have not done that. That was not in the scope of the program, but if the roots are migrating it to the surface sediments, we would have seen it in the chemistry data over time, and we didn't find anything. We actually found that the cover is performing very well. So, indirectly speaking, we didn't see evidence of that. But we did not measure the plant, itself.
Okay, thank you. And it's 12:32, so I'm going to go ahead and call the end of our meeting here. And thank you guys so much for everyone who participated. If you have any additional questions, feel free to send them to our office, gec@glenenvironmental.org, and we'll be happy to help get those answered. And thank you, everyone, all of our speakers, for sharing this event with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rich, for the opportunity.
Thanks,
You're
everybody.
welcome. There will be more soon. All
Thank
right.
you.
Bye-bye.
Y'all have a good day.
Have a good holidays.